BlomCast. Turning Points in History. Wendepunkte in der Geschichte. Welcome to the BlomCast, the podcast that looks at turning points in history. And my God, are we at a turning point in history? And that's why we're not going to look back today, but looking forward. Hi, my name is Philip Blom. I have a terrible cold and I may have to stop this podcast for a few times to cough. I hope I can cut that out. But I had the fantastic opportunity to speaking to, well, probably the guest you want to speak to in this position, especially at this moment in European history. And she is Nathalie Tocci. Nathalie, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Nathalie, you've got a somewhat intimidating CV. You're not only the director of the Istituto Affari Internazionali, you're also a part-time professor. You're an honorary professor in Tübingen. You have advised EU high representatives. You have written the European Global Strategy. You've been a fellow in Harvard, and you've been teaching in other places. When I'm talking to you, you're always somewhere else. You're always on the move. You're always, traveling, but also seeing people, understanding things. And that is why, well, what an opportunity to talk to you. Nathalie, we are talking on the 25th of March, and one or two things have just happened. With regard to this beautiful continent that we're on. One of them I would call the end of the West. And here I want to run something past you that really stunned me. I looked at an interview with a Russian journalist who is not in Russia at the moment because he can't be. But let me just bring this up. His name is Mikhail Tsigar. And he said, what I'm just hearing from Moscow is that people have the feeling there that this is the end of the United States as they were as a leading world power and a harbor of liberal democracy. But it is sort of, they compare it to the breakdown of the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was a state that based on ideology, and when people stopped believing in this ideology, the Soviet Union had to break down. And then they made a very Russian ideology their own, namely cynicism. When I read that, every fiber in my body wanted to say, no, that's not so. But are we seeing a moment where the West, having been deprived of its old enemy 30 years before, is now crumbling itself?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that there is actually a story there, right? I mean, it is in many respects the end of the West. Not necessarily because there is the end of the ideas that held the West together, but because the main artifact, the leader, the creator of that order has sort of come to the conclusion, or at least those who govern the country, but given that now it's the second time, we can't exactly consider this to be a kind of fluke. But the creator of that order seems to believe that that order was not in its interests, right? And so it is absolutely the end of the West. I mean, I think that we would be naive to believe that somehow at some point something will happen and we will, sort of find a shaky equilibrium and maybe in 4 years' time it's all going to be over. I think there is a sort of fundamental break that is ongoing at the moment. Now, the question then becomes, what break are we really talking about? And is the end of the West, so what does it actually imply? So I think there are kind of, sort of different potential answers to this. I mean, if one is to look at the, I'm not quite sure whether to call it the glass half full, but yeah, I mean, let's call it the glass half full. Then what we would say is it may be the end of the West, but there is a rest of the West. that we should be thinking about. And it's quite a, significant group of countries, because if indeed you put together Europe, Canada, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, the rest of the West is not exactly nothing, right? There is a story to be told, and maybe it's the end of the West which is galvanizing the rest of the West. If you see what I mean.
Is it galvanizing it enough, though? I mean, I just wrote a little comment piece for Der Spiegel, and I decided to leave myself a little bit out of the window, and I said, basically, Europe is now, historically speaking, facing a very simple choice. And this is a new situation. The choice is either it will become a federal state, or it will become a series of subjugated colonies in the service of some other power.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And so, actually, if one thinks of it, there is either that rest of the West, which actually uses, quote unquote, the attack upon it as something that enables it to rediscover itself, right? Let me call it perhaps, let's call it a Canadian effect, right? Sort of prior to, what has been happening in the US, I mean, this attempt of the Trump administration to subjugate Canada into becoming a sort of state of the US Federation. There was, this real sense of, sort of a nationalist populist wave in Canada as well, right? And we saw the effect. I mean, the elections haven't happened yet, of course, so we don't quite know what is going to happen and who is going to win. But what is absolutely clear is that already, simply by looking at opinion polls, there has been that galvanizing effect. So I think, one question is this actually going to become a bit of a trend, including in Europe? I mean, here we are amongst, your country, my country, other European countries in which we are in the midst of a second wave of nationalist far-right populism, right? Is the Trump effect on Europe one in which these forces are strengthened, or they are weakened? Yeah, I mean, and this is what really I mean by a Canada effect. And we don't know. I mean, the jury's out. But coming back to your point, indeed, if they are weakened, then indeed there is an opportunity for the rest of the West, beginning in Europe and rediscovering itself. And when it comes to Europe, making that leap forward towards federation. Or, and this is perhaps the paradox in all this, there is a world out there in which actually the West remains united. But it remains united on fundamentally different values, let me say, compared to those values upon which it was founded, right? So, let's go back to J.D. Vance's speech in Munich, right?
Do we have to?
Well, yes, we do have to, because, I mean, what was fascinating about that is that the US vice president essentially said to Europeans, hey, you Europeans, you're kind of veering away from our common values, right? If I hear my own Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, talking about the importance of the West sticking together. Now, what J.D. Vance and Meloni and others, far-right leaders in Europe mean is we, the white and Christian West, the nationalist West. And this goes to your Europe of nations, right? Now, in that conception, indeed, that Europe of nations would be colonies, right? So it would be a disunited Europe in a paradoxically united West, in which rather than being the hegemon of a liberal order, which is what the US was before, the US would be the metropole of an American empire in which European nationalist nations would be the colonies.
Would be, yes, would be a bunch of colonies. One very useful way of bringing this into focus is, I thought, a new book out by Carlo Massala, who has written a book with a simple question: what if Russia wins in Ukraine? And I'm sitting in Vienna. I'm roughly 400 kilometers and a bit away from the Ukrainian border. Between that is Slovakia with Fico and a great friend of Russia. So basically, Austria could border Russia. Austria is, of course, neutral, which people seem to assume means that they're sort of wearing a magic cap that nobody can see them and nobody would attack them. But the scenario of Putin's victory, of a Trumpian peace, actually, because that would destroy half of Ukraine and make the other half a non-feasible, non-sustainable country. That scenario should show us that really then there is no future for Europe.
Yeah, so I mean, firstly, I think it's worth indeed reflecting on what this Russian victory actually means, and then therefore what it implies for us. I mean, I think indeed what it means, starting with Ukraine, I would say, well, it means a Vichy regime Ukraine. And what I mean by this is that much like in the Second World War, Nazi Germany did not militarily occupy the whole of France, but only part of France, but it politically controlled the entire country, hence the Vichy regime. I think the game plan is pretty much the same for Putin in Ukraine, right? Militarily control only part of the country. I think he's probably come to terms with the fact that he's not going to be greeted with flowers elsewhere. But politically, through that military control of part of the territory, politically control the entire country. Now, as we know, the story doesn't end here, right? And so probably I would imagine that a Russian victory also entails, on the one hand, looking towards the north, and therefore, in particular, the Baltics, the ongoing pursuit of a military policy. I think that, again, even when it comes to the Baltics, probably Putin has realized that there's no amount of election interference and disinformation that could do the trick, right? And that therefore military means would be pursued. And of course, presumably now that he thinks and realizes that in many respects, NATO's Article 5 is probably already dead, right? Because the United States would not go to war with Russia to save Lithuania.
But that is the death of NATO, to be quite clear. No Article 5, effectively no NATO.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. And in fact, just to bracket that, and then I'll come back to just a moment to what I was saying, but just a small sort of bracket on this particular point, one could have doubted, right, up until recently, whether Article 5 was valid, right? But the fact that there was a question mark, the fact that we didn't know, was sufficient deterrence, right, for Russia not to probe it. We now know there's no question mark anymore, and the answer is no, right? The US would not go to war to save Estonia or Lithuania, right? And so, as you say, NATO is dead. Now, coming back, though, to the reasoning. So what a Russian victory means. So it means, indeed, you have this Vichy kind of Ukraine, and then you go further, Baltics, again, through a military strategy. But then looking southwards, probably, Russia thinks that it can get away, and it's not necessarily wrong to believe it, with a strategy which is not a full-on military strategy. But indeed, if you think about Moldova, Romania, hence this is why Romania is so important, Bulgaria, and then, of course, Slovakia and Hungary, as you were mentioning already in the pocket, the pursuit of a political strategy based on disinformation, election interference, etc., might do the trick, right? And so we have, absolutely, it might do the trick.
And it might do the trick, to be quite. I mean, we've seen the elections in Romania, we've seen the Stockport riots in Britain, we've seen so many instances where online mischief, shall we call it, causes real results and hurts real people. And this is not a hypothetical scenario.
It's not a hypothetical scenario even in Austria. In Austria, in my own country, Italy, right? So, I mean, it doesn't stop right at the borders of the former Soviet Union. It goes beyond. And so this is, I think, fairly clear what a Russian victory would mean. Now, what does that victory mean for us? And I think there are sort of two elements in this. So on the one hand, there is, in a sense, the sort of harder edge to this, yeah? So is it okay for, it may not be Austria or Italy that is invaded, but do we really think it's okay for Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, whatever, and Poland, who knows, to be invaded, right? And if the answer is we don't care, then, maybe there should be something quite explicit to be said about this. There's no peace loving involved in this, right? I mean, it's not about peace.
No, but also I think it's quite important to make the point. There was just a book published in Germany by a young journalist saying why I would never defend my country. And he said basically living under occupation is shitty, but it's better than being dead. Now, there's a moral argument to be made here. But even putting that aside, this moral argument about cowardice and not standing up for any kind of values, there's a very powerful pragmatic argument here. Europe as an area too small to function in a time of imperial behavior on the global scene, where there's basically three empires that carve up the world, has got nothing to fall back on and would be a constantly destabilized, constantly the target of these attacks, which also, of course, means destabilization is never great for investment, it's never great for the economy, it will eventually be terrible for the democracy, etc., etc. So this is not just a question of people not being as courageous as the Sunday school teacher might have wanted them to be, but this is actually a question mark about the continuous existence of our states as democracies.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. And I think that underlying many of, answers, I mean, sort of there's the poll that you probably, it is the one actually that you're referring to, or if not, I'll mention it anyway. The poll that asked, across different European countries, how many, how many of the citizens would actually be prepared to go to war, not in defense of some other country, but in defense of themselves, right? And you have, I just kind of remembered the Italian figure that was actually the lowest. Only 14%, 14% of the population would be ready to go for war to defend Italy, right? Let alone Lithuania, right? Italy. Now, I mean, the question, though, that I think we should ask ourselves is what's behind this answer? I mean, beyond the lack of courage and all the rest of it, is it also that, deep down, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, people just don't think that this will happen. And this makes me think about, in a sense, our lives post-45, our lives post-89. We in Europe, both Western Europe, post-45, Eastern Europe, post-89, ours has been a movie in which the good guy always won, right? And so it's inconceivable that the bad guy can win, right? And so we are, I think, psychologically kind of trapped in a sort of an odd combination in which, on the one hand, we are very scared, right? I mean, we're very scared of this kind of nasty stuff that comes out there. We somehow want to keep it out, right? We don't have anything to do with it. We stick heads in the sand. But on the other hand, so we're scared, but on the other hand, we're insufficiently anxious, right? We have deep down this sense of, maybe if we just turn the other way, everything's going to be okay, because everything has been okay.
But it means we have no agency, which any psychologist would tell us is a terrible thing. You're scared and you don't have agency. And let me throw in two other things into the mix. I've just spoken to students yesterday, and they wanted to know what the end of religion has meant in Europe. And I said, look, I'm an atheist myself, but basically it has been an anthropological constant, and it's cut a God-shaped hole into people's thinking, which people have tried to fill with all the isms we know, socialism and fascism. And those things were very collective experiences, and they didn't go so well. So with the capitalist turn, we've gone into a very individualist ethic in our countries. We speak to people really more as consumers than as citizens. Consumers don't defend other people's anything. That's not how they work. And the other thing is that I do think that in our European countries, there's a very strong feeling which poisons our democracies throughout, that there is actually no future to be lived for. There is no common project. The best thing we can do is to keep what we have already, because we know that change will be bad for us. And therefore we want to prevent change to keep what we have. And if you don't have a project to defend, if you don't have a future to defend, why would you fight?
I mean, I think you're right. Now, I think there are kind of various possible explanations. Okay, so the explanation, sort of following through what we were saying a moment ago, and in a way, it's actually a positive reading, which basically says, okay, fine, we say that we don't care about these things, but it's deep down because we don't realize that they may really happen. And if shit really hits the fan, right? If it does happen, then actually maybe we would in the end, right? So in a sense, we would rediscover something the minute in which we actually do lose it, and we would fight for it. So that's kind of one possible explanation. The second explanation, which is the one that you were moving towards, is actually no, there's been some sort of deep, sort of almost anthropological change, right? Be it because of the individualization of society, be it because of the fear of the future. And I think both these explanations have some truth to them. What worries me in particular, coming to the point that you were making about the fear about the future, is in particular the way in which this is playing out amongst youth, and the way in particular that far-right nationalists are, in a sense, really latching on to this to essentially, for something, let's just take the example of climate, right? What's behind a young person's move away from the sort of whole Fridays for Future business and into the, I just want my combustion car engine and just kind of zoom my way into oblivion.
And listen to Andrew Tate.
Right, exactly. It's essentially the sense of, in any case, we are screwed, so we may as well make the most of it while it lasts, right? And so underlying this is indeed this real sense of hopelessness. So I think both of these things are there. Now, having said this, the fact that we moved away, and again, just to stick to the climate example, we moved in the, Fridays for Future was not exactly 20 years ago, right? It was 5 years ago. So the fact that we've moved from, Greta Thunberg to Andrew Tate in the space of 5 years, if one is to look at it optimistically, also suggests that it can actually move back, right? I think that if we, on the one hand, have this, sort of sense of, well, maybe when shit hits the fan, we do wake up. And on the other hand, this acknowledgement that there is nothing set in stone and things can flip back. And coming back to the point that you were making about agency, if somehow we manage to get back a sense of yes, we can, well, then yes, we can, right?
There's clever people always say, I can't stand people who see a chance in every crisis. But surely for Europe, this is a moment. Europe has been dormant, probably haunted by its own nightmares. This is a moment where either we surprise ourselves by what is possible after all, or nothing is possible anymore. Europe is not famous for acting swiftly and decisively and for bringing about real change in anything but decades. How good do you think our chances are? I mean, you are actually on the inside. You know the people who are acting. You know the atmosphere. You know the way how things are done. You know how the institutions work. Can we use this to create this other Europe, or is that just a dream for naive moments?
So, I mean, I do think, Philip, that there is a fundamental problem. In fact, I think there are two fundamental problems. I mean, one fundamental problem, which is structural in nature, has to do with the fact that Europe, by which I mean, in this case, the European Union, has been a construct for peacetime, right? And so it is slow and bureaucratic by design, because it is through that slowness and through that bureaucracy that bit by bit, brick by brick, a European house could be built. And of course, it could afford to be slow and bureaucratic because we were in peacetime. There was no hurry, right? I mean, you kind of may as well do things well and take it slowly and, gradually try and bring everyone along with you. Now, of course, the point is that method, if you like, works in peacetime. It does not work in wartime. And so there's a structural problem there that we have to face. Added to that structural problem, there's a political problem. The political problem, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, I think has to do with the fact that there are a number of Trojan horses in the European Union, right? And let's just hope that the list does not grow.
One of them speaks Hungarian, yes.
Right. One of them speaks Hungarian, and he's not now the only one. So, there's a Slovak one, there's a Hungarian one. There was very nearly an Austrian one, right? There could well be very soon a Romanian one. There could be a Czech one. There is a kind of half Italian one, right? So this is not a story that, and it goes back again to the point you were making earlier. So, can we really have these conversations about life and death, right? If around the table you've got a Trojan horse, ? Right? Acting on behalf both of Moscow and of Washington. So that's, I think, a political problem to be faced. Now, this essentially brings us to what is this Europe being born? Because on the one hand, it is not the European Union for the reasons that I just mentioned. On the other hand, it is the European Union because we know that we need to have institutions, for instance, like the European Commission, playing a key role. And indeed, you have the president of the Commission participating in the meetings that Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer, for instance, convene, right? So it is and it isn't the EU. At the same time, it is and it isn't NATO, right? It isn't NATO because obviously the US, the reason why this is happening is because the US has checked out of it, right? As you were discussing earlier. But at the same time, here we have with, sort of bringing along not only the Brits and the Norwegians, but even the Canadians, even the Turks, right, in the room. Because in a sense, in this going back to the rest of the West, in this situation, you kind of need to work with what you have, right? And so you literally kind of latch on to anything. So it isn't and it is NATO at the same time. And so it's this kind of weird coalition of the willing, which, at the moment goes on summit after summit. Great having summits. But at some point, the question arises, what happens in between one summit and the next, right? And what happens in between one summit and the next is either nothing or something. And the difference between the nothing and the something is called institutions, right? It's institutions that do the work in between one summit and the next. And this thing that is being born is not institutionalized, right? Now, I've come recently back from India, and I was having some interesting conversations there about the Quad. And of course, the Quad is not institutionalized. And I was asking them, how do you go about actually...
What is the Quad? Sorry.
So the Quad is basically a grouping that includes the United States, India, Japan, Australia. Did I say Australia? Australia, Japan, India, and the United States. Four. And so the Quad is not institutionalized, but it does do things, right? And so I was asking, so how do you actually do things in between one summit and the next? And they were explaining that they have all of these working groups, one set of which implements the decisions that were taken, another set prepares the next summit to come, and somehow it kind of bumbles along. Now, of course, the point is, though, that these are 4 countries, whereas presumably we would be many more, right? I mean, we would be
35 or something.
Exactly. And so that wouldn't work either. So maybe it's premature to ask this question of institutionalization, but we know what happens when things are not institutionalized. Just think about the European political community, right? In a sense, it had real promise. And for a while, you had heads of state and government that were actually quite excited about participating in this thing where it could be informal and they could say what they wanted. But then it kind of fizzles out, as I said, if there isn't a real work program. So I don't have the answer to this, but I think it's a relevant question because this new Europe that is, I think, fundamentally has to come around and must be united around 3 things. Number 1, most important, we need to be clear about the values, right? What is it we're protecting? I mean, if we're not clear about this, then why on earth do we have to spend on defense? And, we may as well be occupied by the Russians and the Americans and whatnot. So, the sort of value proposition has to be crystal clear. Once that's clear, it becomes, sort of 2 other fundamental points have to be there. On the one hand, there needs to be a clear perception of the threat from Russia. And thirdly, there needs to be a clear perception that there will not be Uncle Sam in his white and shining armor that is going to come to the rescue. And in the best of circumstances, Uncle Sam will ignore us. In the worst of circumstances, Uncle Sam will and is betraying us, right?
This brings me back to something earlier, this curious analogy to the end of the Soviet Union, to the fall of the Soviet Union, and us simply not understanding that this is happening at the moment. Reminds me a bit of the couple Ceausescu standing on that internal courtyard when they were about to be executed, and they would simply not believe what situation they were in, because obviously they were the superior people and the rulers and nobody else mattered. You talk about the values. Now, I've done a certain amount of writing and thinking and even podcasting about the fact that, or about the question, what's happening to the liberal project? Liberal, I mean, in the Enlightenment sense. It doesn't seem to have fared terribly well. And those historical values, those Enlightenment values, of course, they've been dragged through the mud. They've been used to justify just about anything, including the Second Iraq War. And you can also, of course, argue how much of them is still remaining in our societies. I did a very interesting podcast here with Olivier Roy and his beautiful book L'aplatissement du monde, The Flattening of the World, where he makes this point that in this globalized, digitized age, culture erodes and is replaced by external norms, which I found a brilliant observation. Also one that says a lot about the EU. But when you say we have to be clear about the values, what's left of them and how credible are they still?
Well, that is indeed that is the question. I do, and I mean, as of late, I've been quite dark in my mood, but I actually do think that there is something left, right? I mean, I do think, I was just looking at the Eurobarometer figures that came out, was it yesterday, in which, support for European Union is now at an average of 74%, highest that it has been in, decades. I mean, certainly, sort of well before the global financial crisis, right? Now, what is behind that support? Surely it does have to do with a sort of juxtaposition between what we recognize ourselves as being and what we recognize others as being. And by others, it inevitably, I mean, we come back to Putin's Russia, we come back to Trump's US. So, I mean, I haven't looked enough into this to be able to give you something which would be in any way, shape, or form empirically sound. But my hunch is that there is something there, right, that is still left. The question is, are we able to capitalize on this? Are we able to use this moment to revive something, to remind ourselves of what we are, what we stand for, coming back, all the way down to what are we ready to fight for, right? Which requires, on the one hand, as I said, a kind of clarity about what you're protecting, and on the other hand, a clarity about why and by whom you're being threatened. And I'm not too pessimistic about the fact that actually there is a critical mass of countries and of, public opinion that will, go along with this. Perhaps not everyone quite on the front line, but at least as I said, a critical mass that is sufficient to actually help us navigate this.
What is the mood in Brussels when you talk to people there, the people who have to push these things on, or perhaps to slow them down because they don't believe in them? But I mean, what is the situation that you find there at the moment? When you listen to Ursula von der Leyen, you have the feeling that she's saying a lot of the right things, and she's saying them in a very resolute voice, as is her way. But that doesn't mean that will be tomorrow's policy.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, okay, so the point here comes back to the slowness, but I wanted to come back to the values part of this, because one problem that is, again, sort of part of the structural problem within the EU is that, and especially the institutions in Brussels, and especially the Commission, is that inevitably you focus on policy. Right? I mean, you focus on policy. So at the moment, it means you focus on defense and you focus on competitiveness and everything that revolves around it. And, these things, especially if we come to defense, we do them. But unless we do them with, sort of, again, very clear in mind why we're doing it, if we're not clear about that, it can actually be extremely dangerous. Right? Just think, without even going to Brussels, just go to Berlin. What does a Germany that, spends another, sort of 500-600 billion on defense in a hypothetical world in which the AfD comes to power? Right? I mean, we would all be totally freaked out, right? And rightly so, may I add.
Yes, we totally would be.
Right. So this is why I think the problem with Brussels is not necessarily that they have the wrong policy instincts, but on the one hand, they're structurally, they're not built to think about the why question. They're built to think about the what and the how, whereas the why question is really the beating heart of this conversation.
It always seems to me that Europe was founded almost out of suspicion for European populations, against European population, as a federation of states, not of peoples. And with any great alliance between former arch enemies, what do? You don't talk about political principles. You talk about technical problems and their solutions. There you can meet. That seems to me no longer to be a valid premise for this tomorrow's Europe. And when you go back to what our friend Mr. Tsigar said, that in the Soviet Union people had stopped believing in socialism, at the moment you get the feeling that people have stopped believing in liberal democracy. Now, there may be a lot of reasons for that, but how significant do you think is that? Is that indeed a parallel? Have people basically abandoned this system because they believe they're no longer invested in it, it's not in their interest, they believe it's being run by nefarious elites? Do you think this is the beginning of the end of democracies in Europe?
I think we have come to the end of one method. And, I was kind of rereading, partly because my own prime minister attacked it violently. I was rereading the Manifesto Ventotene, written by Altiero Spinelli, Ernesto Rossi, Colorni, when they were imprisoned on the island of Ventotene during the Second World War. So they wrote, imprisoned by the fascists, obviously wrote the manifesto on the island, and they were talking about European federation. And they were talking about European federation in an eminently political way, right? So it's about the federalizing of peoples, right? And it was indeed premised on the notion that the only way to secure peace on the continent was through the overcoming of nationalisms, essentially understood as the source of all evil. And it was fascinating because, the Italian prime minister chooses, here we are having these debates about defense and rearm EU and all the rest of it. She chooses to go to the Italian parliament to attack the Manifesto of Ventotene. By the way, I should also say that, I'm personally not neutral to this debate, insofar as the institute that I direct, the Istituto Affari Internazionali, was founded by no less than Altiero Spinelli. And so, in a sense, I'm definitely partisan to this debate, right? But anyway.
She's a bit behind the curve attacking this manifesto now.
Well, yes and no, if you think of it, right? Yes and no, because in a sense, and this comes back to your question, if it is true, and I think it is true, that we've come to the end of a method that was not a Spinelli method, right? Because in a sense, the Spinelli method would have seen something that started off in a far more political way, right? Rather than in this kind of bit by bit construction, of a method by not really talking about the political stuff. And I mean, in a sense, again, he wrote his manifesto during wartime, right? The European construction was based on peacetime, and so it followed a different method. But as you say, it was a method that basically took the people out. And fundamentally, what we've come to, and I think this is a story that's with us, not as of now, but as of, at the very least, the global financial crisis, we've come to the end of that method, right? So in a sense, she's not behind the curve, because if it is true that it's the end of that method, then we come back to something which is far more binary. So either it's the Meloni, Orban, anti-Spinelli, if you see what I mean, Europe of nations, right? That she would probably think of as being great, and I would think much as Spinelli as being the source of all evil, right? Or you actually go back and, pick back that method that was never implemented and try and understand what it actually could imply in this rebirth of Europe.
That's a big change in European DNA, isn't it? I mean, what made Europe great, apart from access to the open ocean, was arguably the competition between small nations who always were at war with each other and therefore vied for every little technological advantage. Just leaving a bit of pause for cutting. So the nationhood, the peoplehood, the antagonism between these peoples, that's been 2,000 years of history. The European experiment has been a few decades. What will it take for Europeans to change their cultural, their historical DNA so much to put that conception of safety in the small family aside for safety in a bigger family?
Well, I mean, I think the switch that needs to be made, and of course, I've got a kind of professional sort of, bias in this, is um, realizing, and I think people get it, right? Realizing that the rationale for European unity and integration today is an external one. It's a global one, right? It is the sense that unless we are united, we will be small fat chicken in a jungle. And small fat chicken in a jungle don't last long, right? So it becomes existential. And so, in that jungle, you either unite and become a kind of mid-sized elephant. And, I mean, if you are a mid-sized elephant, perhaps you're not the lion, perhaps you're not the tiger or even the bear. But, I mean, you can kind of get by, right? Or you end up as the small fat chicken, right? It's fat because we're rich.
Yes, 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 yes.
And so I think that fundamentally, this is not a hard message for people to get. And I think that intuitively, people understand it. And I think underlying that 74%, again, of Europeans that all of a sudden rediscover their love for the European Union, there is this, right? The question is, are we going to have a political class that has the vision, that has the courage to actually push this through and the stamina to push this through? I don't know. I mean, there isn't one single name that comes to mind, but maybe some sort of combination between the Merz and Macrons and Tusks of this world, and maybe even Starmers, right? Let's bring back the Brits. Maybe that's sufficient to do the trick. I don't know. But what I do know is that if there is an understanding, both amongst the publics and amongst the leadership, that this is not a nice to do. This is not something that we do because we're good people, right? This is something that we do because it's existential. Then either we fail, and if we fail, maybe we were already dead, right? Because, of course, in principle, we can succeed because we are fat, right? I mean, we are amongst the richest countries in the world. So, of course, we can do it if we want to. And so if we fail, it's because we were already dead in the first place. And if we're not dead, then almost by definition, the recognition that it's existential means that we will succeed because we can.
Historians are always asked about parallels and are we living in the 1930s again, or are we, which is the parallel that makes us understand all of this? I never particularly believe in parallels, though I'm quite seduced by the idea of, Christopher Clark's The Sleepwalkers. I think sleepwalking is quite an interesting motif to look at the last 20 years of European history. And you see how intelligent, well-informed people have sleepwalked themselves and their countries into this scenario. But one thing that you can say is a historical constant is that if circumstances have changed suddenly and dramatically through whatever, the most important thing is to have new categories to think in. You can no longer understand this new situation with your old categories in your head. Which categories do you think we have to switch out for different ones to understand the new global situation that we're in?
So, I mean, I do think that there is, that liberal international order is out. The question is what is in. And essentially, there are two kind of possible options or indeed paradigms. And one represents an existential threat to us, and the other does not. In fact, the other is what enables us to continue living in kind of free and sort of prosperous societies in Europe. So the one which represents an existential threat to us is a world of empires, right? So it's a world in which there's an American empire and a Russian empire and a Chinese empire. Maybe at some point the Indians have the hope that they might be upgraded into empire. But anyhow, let's say at the moment there are these three. We're not part of that. We're the colonies, right? And whether this is Eastern Europeans that are part of one empire or West Europeans that are part of the other, but of a very different kind. Because, some, especially on the left, might say, but weren't we American colonies anyway? Well, no, we were not, right? I mean, let's be very clear about this point. Of course, power relations mattered, and they always have done. I mean, you were kind of citing the war in Iraq. I mean, we followed the Americans in all sorts of stupid things because power relations mattered. But kind of institutions and laws and norms and, these kind of like things that now Donald Trump thinks are unnecessary shackles on the American animal spirit, right? These things also mattered. In fact, if they didn't matter, Trump wouldn't want to destroy them, right? So, in the sense, it's the proof that they mattered. So we were not colonies. So there is a paradigm out there, which is the one that represents an existential threat to us, which is indeed the one of empire. And then there is a second paradigm. And the second paradigm does not mean a return to the past. I think that is out. It can be constituted by coming back to an earlier point, the rest of the rest of the West with the rest, right? And by that rest, what I mean is countries in partly the poor South, partly the global South, right, that are uncomfortable with that world in empire, towards whom I think we actually have to reach out a lot more. So the most stupid thing in the world that we could be doing is, as we increase our defense spending, cut our development assistance, because in fact what we should be doing is actually doubling down on that as well. So I think there is a world in which the rest of the West, together with the rest, actually rethinks the norms and the institutions of an international order, right? And, it may not be an order whose norms are as thick as those of the liberal international order. It may be that we will just have to do with Article 51 of the UN Charter, non-aggression, non-acquisition of territory by force, sovereignty. I mean, it may be that it has to be fairly basic, but surely a world in which there are at least those rules of the road is better than one of empire in which there are none at all.
One of the few rules that you can extract from history is that empires have one tendency, that they have to keep growing. The only exception is when technologies get in the way. So the Chinese empire really couldn't grow very much because transport ways were too far, messages traveled too slowly. There was always already a province that was rebelling, so they were basically busy inside their already vast empire. But most empires have tended to grow because they need new conquests, which means empires tend to get in each other's way. And that is the unattractive part, shall we say, of the objectively unattractive part of the imperial logic. At some point, whether that is markets that are intersecting, economic interests, or indeed territorial interests, empires tend to get into each other's way. This Europe of the West and the rest, perhaps a Europe focused initially on France and Britain and Germany and Poland and Italy, as powers that are willing to strike out a bit more boldly, that would ally itself with places like Canada and New Zealand and Australia, etc. How much of a chance would it have to maintain and preserve and give voice to a different vision of politics, a vision of politics that is not imperial and not the rule of the jungle, but a vision of politics that is rooted in the European experience, in the bitter European experience of being tossed from war to war and from genocide to genocide, and having decided that democracy, boring as it is, at least saves us from civil war and from obscene accretions of power.
I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think I think there's no real question about what those underlying principles are. I think the harder nut to crack is exactly what would be the different process, right? I mean, the different the different institutional sort of, mechanisms to kind of bring about the revival of those ideas. And here we come back also to, to how to bring in this kind of second iteration, if you like, of a European and not just European revival, the people as part of this plot in a more substantive way. Also, going back to, I think, technology, I think, also has a sort of role to play. I mean, we went through, in a sense, Mark 1 of the digital revolution that was essentially understood as a revolution of communications as actually being viewed as something positive for democracy. I mean, think about the Arab Spring, right? Or at least the beginning of the Arab Spring before it became winter. And then now a second mark, in a sense, in the technological revolution, which is technology which is it's relatively less about communication and connectivity, and technology which hinges more on data and therefore surveillance. And so whereas, in a sense, Mark 1 was good for democracy, Mark 2 is good for authoritarianism, right? So is there, in a sense, a Mark 3 that goes back to Mark 1, but inevitably nothing ever goes back to the past?
No, I mean, I think the Mark 3 looks rather more sinister than the Mark 2, actually.
But that's the thing. So we're not going to stop technology. So is there a way to use it in a different way, right? Because we're not going to be able to simply bracket it out.
Is there market interest to use it in a different way?
Well, there isn't a supply side interest. The question is whether there is a demand side interest, right? And I think that's what we need to think about. I don't have an answer to this, but I do think that we can exclude it as part of the solution.
Nathalie, this is a fascinating conversation. All good things, however, I have to come to an end. And therefore, one last question. I have a vague suspicion how you may answer this, but we've already touched on it a little bit. Is it time to repoliticize Europe?
Yes, but not in the way in which we have done so up until now. What I mean by this is the conversation about a political Europe actually started, back in the day of, the whole debate on the Spitzenkandidat and, should be, and back then, eventually, who became the president of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, essentially said, mine will be a political commission. And then, came along his successor, von der Leyen, Mark 1, and she says, well, mine will be a geopolitical commission. And now, with this whole thing about competitiveness and all the rest of it, it's like, and it will be a geoeconomic commission. So I think that has been, in retrospect, and I wasn't against it when it happened to begin with. I thought, maybe indeed, having a more political commission may be a good idea. But in the end, actually, if you think of it, it has been the worst of possible worlds because it has politicized the commission. Once upon a time, you had commissioners that used to refer to their member state of origin as the country I know best, right? Now, very rarely would you find a commissioner that would refer to his member state as the country I know best. They would define themselves as the Austrian commissioner and the Italian commissioner and whatnot. So I think there's a a bad politicization, right? Which really has to do with a sort of importing within the supranational component that renationalization, right? And there is a different politicization, right? A different political union, which inevitably has to come from the bottom up, right? And not from that top down.
Well, that'll be a fascinating thing to see. Nathalie, I'm looking forward to picking this up in a year or so and seeing where things have taken us. Thank you for sharing that with you, and thank you for your time. This was a conversation with the wonderful Nathalie Tocci in the BlomCast. You can subscribe. In fact, you should, damn it. You should hit that button straight away. And anyway, tell all your friends and your favorite enemies of this podcast because it's simply fantastic. It's got guests like Nathalie. What can I say? So, for this time, I have to say goodbye, but I'm looking forward to see you very soon again, and it'll be sooner than before because this podcast is picking up speed. Bye-bye.